Being No One, The Self-Model Theory of Subjectivity by Thomas Metzinger. 1.2 Questions. In this section, I want to develop a small and concise set of questions in order to guide us through the complex theoretical landscape associated with the phenomenon of subjective experience. I promise that in the final chapter of this book, I will return to each one of these questions by giving brief, condensed answers to each of them. The longer answers, however, can only be found in the middle chapters of this book. This book is written for readers, and one function of the following minimal catalog of philosophical problems consists in increasing its usability. However, this small checklist could also function as a starting point for a minimal set of criteria for judging the current status of competing approaches, including the one presented here. How many of these questions can it answer in a satisfactory way? Let us look at them. A first and basic group of questions concerns the meaning of some of the explanatory core concepts already introduced above. What does it mean to say of a mental state that it is conscious? Alternatively, what does it mean of a conscious system, a person, a biological organism, or an artificial system, if taken as a whole, to say that it is conscious? What does it mean to say of a mental state that it is part of a given system's self-consciousness? What does it mean for any conscious system to possess a phenomenal self? Is selfless consciousness possible? What does it mean to say of a mental state that it is a subjective state? What does it mean to speak of whole systems as subjects of experience, quote unquote? What is a phenomenal first-person perspective, for example, as opposed to a linguistic, cognitive, or epistemic first-person perspective? Is there anything like aperspectival consciousness or even self-consciousness? Next, there is a range of questions concerning ontological, logical semantic, and epistemological issues. They do not form the focus of this investigation, but they are of great relevance to the bigger picture that could eventually emerge from an empirically based philosophical theory of self-consciousness. Is the notion of a subject logically primitive? Does its existence have to be assumed a priori? Ontologically speaking, does what we refer to by subject belong to the basic constituents of reality, or is it an entity that could, in principle, be eliminated in the course of scientific progress? In particular, the semantics of the indexical word I needs further clarification. What is needed is a better understanding of a certain class of sentences, namely those in which the word I is used in the auto-phenomenological self-ascription of phenomenal properties, as in, I am feeling a toothache right now. What are the truth conditions for sentences of this type? Would the elimination of the subject use of I leave a gap in our understanding of ourselves? Is subjectivity an epistemic relation? Do phenomenal states possess truth values? Do consciousness, the phenomenal self, and the first-person perspective supply us with a specific kind of information or knowledge not to be gained by any other means? Does the incorrigibility of self-ascriptions of psychological properties imply their infallibility? Are there any irreducible facts concerning the subjectivity of mental states that can only be grasped under a phenomenal first-person perspective, or only be expressed in the first-person singular? Can the thesis that the scientific worldview must, in principle, remain incomplete be derived from the subjectivity of the mental? Can subjectivity in its full content be naturalized? Does anything like first-person data exist? Can introspective reports compete with statements originating from scientific theories of the mind? The true focus of the current proposal, however, is phenomenal content, the way certain representational states feel from the first-person perspective. Of particular importance are attempts to shed light on the historical roots of certain philosophical intuitions, like, for instance, the Cartesian intuition that I could always have been someone else, or that my own consciousness necessarily forms a single unified whole, or that phenomenal experience actually brings us in direct and immediate contact with ourselves and the world around us. Philosophical problems can frequently be solved by conceptual analysis or by transforming them into more differentiated versions. However, an additional and interesting strategy consists in attempting to also uncover their introspective roots. A careful inspection of these roots may help us to understand the intuitive force behind many bad arguments, a force that typically survives their rebuttal. I will therefore supplement my discussion by taking a closer look at the genetic conditions for certain introspective certainties. What is the phenomenal content of mental states as opposed to their representational or intentional content? Are there examples of mentality exhibiting one without the other? Do double dissociations exist? How do Cartesian intuitions, like the contingency intuition, the indivisibility intuition, or the intuition of epistemic immediacy, emerge? Arguably, the human variety of conscious subjectivity is unique on this planet, namely, in that it is culturally embedded, in that it allows not only for introspective, but also for linguistic access, and in that the contents of our phenomenal states can also become the target of exclusively internal cognitive self-reference. In particular, it forms the basis of intersubjective achievements. The interesting question is how the actual contents of experience change through this constant integration into other representational media, and how specific contents may genetically depend on social factors. Which new phenomenal properties emerge through cognitive and linguistic forms of self-reference? In humans, are there necessary social correlates for certain kinds of phenomenal content? A final set of phenomenological questions concerns the internal web of relations between certain phenomenal state classes or global phenomenal properties. Here is a brief selection. What is the most simple form of phenomenal content? Are there anything like qualia in the classic sense of the word? What is the minimal set of constraints that have to be satisfied for conscious experience to emerge at all? For instance, could qualia exist without the global property of consciousness, or is a qualia-free form of consciousness conceivable? What is phenomenal selfhood? What precisely is the non-conceptual sense of ownership that goes along with the phenomenal experience of selfhood or of being someone? How is the experience of agency related to the experience of ownership? Can both forms of phenomenal content be dissociated? Can phenomenal selfhood be instantiated without qualia? Is embodiment necessary for selfhood? What is a phenomenally represented first-person perspective? How does it contribute to other notions of perspectivalness? For example, logical or epistemic subjectivity. Can one have a conscious first-person perspective without having a conscious self? Can one have a conscious self without having a conscious first-person perspective? In what way does a phenomenal first-person perspective contribute to the emergence of a second-person perspective and to the emergence of a first-person plural perspective? What forms of social cognition are inevitably mediated by phenomenal self-awareness? Which are not? Finally, one last question concerns the status of phenomenal universals. Can we define a notion of consciousness and subjectivity that is hardware and species independent? This issue amounts to an attempt to give an analysis of consciousness, the phenomenal self, and the first-person perspective that operates on the representational and functional levels of description alone, aiming at liberation from any kind of physical domain specificity. Can there be a universal theory of consciousness? In other words, is artificial subjectivity possible? Could there be non-biological phenomenal selves?